The white cop thought he owned the streets just because of a cheap badge and a bit of rotten authority. But life isn't like the ridiculous action movies he watched. Especially when the victim turns out to be a black CIA agent with powers enough to make him wet his pants. In a world where evil wears the guise of protectors, what happens when real power is challenged? That fateful punch didn't just strike her face. It struck his inflated ego. Which state do you live in? And how are the cops there? Kyle Breener is a white officer on the Riverside City Patrol, a place that seems peaceful but simmers with long-rooted prejudice. That afternoon, the sun poured molten fire down on Boulevard 7. Cars rolled by in steady streams. Convenience stores did brisk business, and music from the coffee shop mingled with the blare of horns and footsteps. Yet, no one suspected that within seconds a social upheaval would erupt on the sidewalk. Under the blazing sun in broad daylight before the eyes of dozens of bystanders, Elisa Monroe was crossing the street with calm composure, an oversized jacket draped over a dark sheath dress that was neither conspicuous nor entirely ordinary, but enough to irritate Kyle. There was no concrete reason, no evidence, no distress call. Only his gaze lingered on her long enough for his racist reflexes to scream that something was wrong with this black woman. He swerved his patrol car onto the curb, lights flashing, siren wailing provocatively, hand hovering at the holster of his Glock 22. Without greeting or introduction, he strode toward her as if it were his domain, sizing her head to toe with eyes that saw her as less than human. Elisa paused mid-step, eyes unblinking, standing as though she had endured this too many times to be surprised. Kyle cast a cursory glance at her outfit, a crossbody canvas bag, flat shoes, nothing threatening, but that simplicity made him feel threatened. Just by how you dress, I can tell you're hiding something, he sneered, contempt dripping from his words as he took a provocative step closer. Elisa remained silent. She met his gaze, not with fear, not with submission, not with defiance, but with a quiet stare so profound it unsettled anyone who held it. But Kyle did not fear silence. Or rather, he was used to striking before thinking. He lunged and punched, no warning, no justification. A twisting, shoulder-driven blow landed squarely on Elisa's face with a vicious crack that echoed across the midday street, punctuated by the gasp of onlookers who realized what was happening. The black woman, unresisting, undramatic, had just been punched by a white officer in broad daylight for no reason other than his feeling that she deserved it. Elisa was thrown backward, her hair tumbling free from its tie, blood trickling from her lip onto the hot pavement. Yet, she did not fall or step back. She turned and looked at Kyle, not with hatred nor pity, but with a gaze that would strip away anyone's armor if held long enough. Revealing hidden motives behind uniform and badge, Kyle froze for a split second. An instinctive reaction, a silent alarm before his ego, honed by decades of hiding insecurity behind power, pushed that instinct aside. The crowd closed in, some raising phones to record. A young woman screamed, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" Kyle barked back, "Clear out. This is a security stop." She's not cooperating. No one believed him. No one saw a weapon or defiance. All they saw was blood. Blood stained the white pavement. And a woman still standing. They perceived that stillness is more terrifying than the punch itself. More terrifying than resistance, because it carried an implicit message no one dared to name. She was used to this. Elisa brushed her fingertips against the blood at the corner of her mouth, watching the dark smear spread across her skin, then lifted her head and stared at Kyle again. No one heard her speak. Perhaps she truly said nothing. Perhaps she whispered something only Kyle could hear. But at that moment, he swallowed very softly, a sound no one else noticed. But to him it was a signal. For the first time in uniform, he realized he had struck something beyond the reach of handcuffs or bullets. A force unseen and unheard, but unmistakably present in that gaze. Backup arrived. A female officer touched Elisa's shoulder and guided her away. No handcuffs, no force. She walked with her head held high past the crowd of cameras and stunned, outraged, sympathetic faces, none daring to touch her. Kyle remained rooted in place, fists clenched, unsure if he felt anger, fear, or simply trying to steady himself. Because under that blinding sun, He understood at last that he was not the one holding power. He was a man who had just punched something he could not name, but which would not let him go. That phrase etched itself into Kyle's mind. Back to his patrol car. He drove with the dry, iron-like tang of blood still clinging to his pores, seeping into the gearshift, coating the steering wheel, every familiar movement now tainted. But today the repetition was not a procedure. It was unease. Elisa Monroe had not screamed, not reacted, not cursed. Precisely because of that, she occupied his every thought. He had arrested hundreds, thrown punches, deployed restraints, witnessed blood, screams, even people wetting themselves in panic. But never had anyone made him feel as if he were staring into a bottomless abyss. One that threatened to swallow him whole. Inside the patrol car, the radio still crackled codes and incoming calls. But he could no longer hear them. His ears rang, his vision blurred, not from sunlight nor stress, but from that gaze, silent, profound, not the look of a victim, but something Kyle dared not name. It was as if she had seen into him, past his actions to the depths he had never dared explore. He tried to convince himself it was a normal psychological reaction, that anyone subjected to such scrutiny would feel unsteady. Yet when he gripped the wheel with both hands, he felt it tremble, not much, but unmistakably. Fingers that had snapped joints and crushed resistance now shook in an invisible void of fear. Not guilt, not fear of lawsuits, nor fear of the crowd, but something deeper, the sense that he had overstepped, touching a structure he should never have approached. Elisa sat in the backseat of the patrol car, hands folded before her, uncuffed, eyes fixed forward. She spoke no word, made no plea, posed no question. She simply sat upright as if wholly in command of the moment. There was no sign of vulnerability, only the dark stain of dried blood at her lip and that unwavering gaze. Kyle glanced in the rearview mirror and, upon meeting those eyes again, turned away immediately. He felt less like the one in control than a pawn in a game whose rules he did not know. The car stopped in the station's back lot where no press or outsiders loitered. 2 officers stepped forward to open the doors, but Elisa rose before anyone could steady her. Each of her steps was light, yet it seemed to crack the very ground beneath her. She showed no weakness, though attacked in public. She entered the station as though returning to a familiar place. Kyle trailed behind her, though he should have led the procession. He did not understand why he gave no orders, uttered no threats, raised no voice, simply did not dare to. While processing her information, a clerk ran a routine identity search. The fingerprint scanner glowed red as it processed data. The screen blinked. No name, no record, no photo, no address, no documents. A completely blank file. The clerk assumed a system error and tried again. Same result. Kyle felt his mouth grow dry, a lump rising in his throat as if something pressed against him, forcing him to swallow the truth. The clerk attempted an advanced biometric scan. Alpha 7 illuminated the console. Then a warning appeared. Access denied. National Clearance Level 1 required. Report directly to Langley. The processing room fell silent. Another clerk reached for a phone. But the precinct commander strode in, stared at the screen, then at Elisa, and hurled the handset onto the desk, shattering it. His face went ashen. "Goddamn, we just messed with the wrong person," he muttered, not in anger, but despair. No one laughed. No one questioned him. They all understood what it meant. Kyle sat in a corner, ashen-faced, hands on his thighs, no longer trembling, but utterly numb. Sweat soaked his uniform despite the chill in the room. He watched Elisa being led into a private room to rest. Not a holding cell. No orders were given, but everyone tacitly understood. She was no longer a detainee. She was not a suspect. She was something beyond any template they knew. And that realization reduced the entire room, people who once believed they controlled the rules, to silent spectators awaiting judgment. Kyle had never been interrogated. Yet for the first time, he felt what it meant to be crushed by someone who needed neither words nor touch to suffocate him. And what terrified him most was not lawsuits, cameras, or disciplinary hearings, but the final words she had uttered in the car, soft enough that only he could have heard, yet echoing like thunder in his chest. "You just did something you cannot take back." Those words pierced silently inward, like a tiny pin driven into his central nerve, leaving Kyle unable to shake the shiver coursing through him. He sat dazed in the stark white processing room, normally his safe zone, the command center, the hub of control, but now nothing seemed to obey its usual rules. Every eye furtively flicked toward the screen where Elisa's data should have appeared long ago. Yet it remained blank. No file, no identifier, no criminal history, no driver's license, no address, no blood type, no hospital records, no academic trace, nothing to show that this woman had ever existed in the nation's civilian system. To this law enforcement apparatus, Elisa Monroe was a ghost. Never born, never grown, never dying, belonging to nowhere. The data clerk tried for the third time to run an advanced biometric scan. Alpha 7 verification, an encryption protocol normally reserved for the intelligence community's darkest corners. But instead of yielding results, the screen froze for several seconds before flashing a crimson warning. Access blocked. Report immediately to Langley. This was not merely an alert. It was a command, one that superseded county police authority, state jurisdiction, even federal oversight. The commander, always outwardly unflappable, snapped to his feet at the sight of that message. No one dared breathe too deeply. He strode to the console, scanned the warning again, then abruptly pulled his phone from his pocket and slammed it onto the stone tabletop, shattering it. His face drained of color. "Goddamn, we just messed with the wrong person," he muttered, cursing himself and all who had let this happen. A chill raced down every spine in the room. No one knew the details, but they all understood. This was no longer about an officer striking a woman. It was about an officer who had struck someone the system had no right to question. Kyle felt his skin tingle as if jolted by electricity. The air grew viscous, like glue tightening with every struggle. He looked around at his colleagues. Faces now ashen, sweat beading on brows. Once the same officers who patted him on the back at the coffee station. Now silent, no one spoke or asked questions. They drew inward as if a single misstep would pull them into the eye of the storm. He recognized this feeling that something far greater than his chain of command, greater than the United States itself, was moving behind the scenes. In the surveillance room, security cameras continued to capture every frame, every footstep, every glance. Yet, the server had automatically switched Elisa's footage to top-secret encryption storage, normally reserved for national-level data. The clips from the moment she entered the station were now beyond the precinct's access. A young technician attempted to override the lock with root privileges but was met with, "This action will be logged and reported." He recoiled, genuine fear in his eyes. Meanwhile, Elisa remained seated in the private interview room. Not a cell, and the door was unlocked. No one dared confine her. No orders were given, yet all avoided her gaze. She asked for nothing, no lawyer, no medical attention, simply sat with her head bowed, fingers interlaced, eyes closed. Perhaps she was thinking, observing, or perhaps doing nothing at all, letting the system swallow its own catastrophic mistake. A junior officer, assigned to bring her water, stood hesitantly outside the door for over 2 minutes before placing a cup at the threshold and retreating. No one dared approach her. Kyle was summoned to an internal meeting. The division chief, the deputy director of investigations, and the legal advisor were all present. No one sat. They formed a circle like participants in a secret tribunal. The division chief asked, "Do you know who she is?" Kyle shook his head. No, a bare truth he could not escape. They knew he did not know. But what terrified them was that he had acted on that ignorance as though he held unquestioned authority. "We cannot protect you anymore," the chief said evenly, but with weighty implication. Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but his throat tightened. He understood he had crossed a line. Not an ethical line, not a legal line, but the line of survival. There are people whose mere presence can rend the power structure to its core. And Elisa Monroe was one of them. As dusk fell, Elisa was escorted from the station in silence. No handcuffs, no formal escort, just a black SUV waiting at the rear exit. Unmarked and unremarkable, she stepped inside without looking back. Kyle watched from a third-floor window, and whether it was the fading light or something else, he saw his hand tremble again. But this time the tremor came from a question echoing in his mind. Who is she? That question hovered in Kyle's mind and in the minds of all who bore witness. Yet the answer lay only in Elisa's silence. Strangely, after a day in which the system seemed fractured by her mere presence. The very next morning, Elisa Monroe appeared as if nothing had happened. She did not leave town. She did not go to a hospital or a courthouse. She did not visit a lawyer's office. She simply walked as always, her small sunglasses shading half her face, a canvas bag slung casually over her shoulder, and entered an old building on the corner of 4th Street, where no one asks about the past, only talks about today. St. Rose's Community Center sits in a quiet residential block, its yellow walls faded, its windows plastered with crayon drawings by children. Here, no one addresses another by title. There are no badges or resumes to check. Only children, mostly those born deaf, whose ears have never heard the world call their names properly, but whose eyes always see who is real and who is not. From the first day Elisa arrived, not a single child feared her. No one asked why her hand bore a faint scar or why her gaze always seemed tuned to something deeper than words. They simply knew that whenever she laid a gentle hand on their shoulder, the cacophony in their minds stilled. No more noise. No more chaos, only a calm that only someone who had weathered the fiercest storm could bring. She was never late, she never raised her voice and never spoke of herself. Her colleagues knew only that her name was Elisa. No surname, no social media, no family photos. Yet when she taught, the children watched as if learning a language absent from any textbook. The language of unconditional understanding. No one could have guessed that less than 24 hours earlier, this woman had frozen an entire law enforcement apparatus. And that mystery made her a secret none dared to unravel. One day in class, a little girl named Eliza wrote on the whiteboard, "Are you sad that you can't hear like us?" Elisa smiled softly, placed her hand on her heart, then pointed to Eliza's eyes and shook her head. The child nodded and took her hand. No words were needed. The other children were the same. They mastered sign language but also learned to feel presence. Elisa needed no voice. Her presence was enough, a language the adult world might never fully grasp. Not everyone was satisfied, however. Some parents initially wondered, who is this woman? Why is there no information about her? Why does the center employ someone with no clear background? Yet each time she appeared, those questions fell away. Their searches yielded nothing, no online profile, no public degrees, no prior work history, but the children adored her. And in a world where only children speak the truth, that mattered more than any official seal. Someone once crept close when Elisa stood in the hallway, hoping to overhear a phone call. But she never called. The phone she carried was an old model, no touchscreen, no apps, no SIM, a perfect cover. No one suspected a thing. For in a busy world, someone too quiet is usually deemed harmless. The center's administration never questioned her paperwork. Each month, Elisa submitted complete, neatly typed forms, all with proper signatures, and no one verified their source. Because each time she taught, children who could not focus for more than 5 minutes would sit rapt for an entire hour. Once, a child diagnosed with a developmental disorder whispered, "She's not like ordinary adults. She knows when we're afraid." That remark stopped another teacher in her tracks because it rang true. There was something about Elisa that made people feel she did not come from the same reality. Every noon, when the children snacked and rested, she would step out to the second-floor balcony where an old wooden chair and a lavender pot sat waiting. She would sit there with eyes closed, back straight, hands on her lap, listening to something far away. Once, the gatekeeper found her still and unmoving for 42 minutes. No phone, no book, no sleep. Yet, when she returned to class, her eyes shone as if she had just emerged from a battle in her mind that no one else could see. Although unspoken, everyone at the center felt something unusual, not in a negative way, but in a profound sense. Elisa's presence seemed to slow time. When she passed by, children's laughter rang clearer. When she sat down, the world seemed muted, as though someone had turned down its volume. But because no one had cause to question, life went on as before. A perfect cover, not because it was cunningly constructed, but because it left no crack for suspicion to slip through. while Elisa quietly sat on the second-floor balcony of the community center. Another hand on the opposite side of the city was trembling, not from emotion, but from the cold awareness that a single wrong click could bring down an entire domino chain of power. Rebecca Lynn, an internal security officer within the Federal Data Control System, was no stranger to cover-ups, erasures, and the silent deletion of risky individuals from national databases when ordered. Her job lived in the gray zones of legality where there were no courts, no juries, only unspoken commands from levels of authority whose files didn't exist in any official archive. But tonight, as Rebecca opened a file containing footage of Kyle Breener's punch, blood splattering under sunlight, Elisa's still and chilling gaze, her hands froze above the keyboard. The screen showed the usual file metadata, timestamp, format, resolution, storage path, everything in proper order. But one thing was missing, the reason. She had deleted more videos than anyone in the system. Once it was footage of a Special Forces officer accidentally shooting a civilian in the dark. Once it was a senior police official abusing power in an interrogation room. Once it was a clip never meant to be seen because the person in it was the son of a senator. But none of those had ever made her stop breathing. Rebecca watched frame by frame. Every movement. What she saw wasn't simple violence. It was the system colliding with something it couldn't define. Elisa stared directly into the camera. Not panicked, not weak, not needing protection. She wasn't a victim. And that was precisely what made the footage a genuine threat. Rebecca received the command from above. A short call. No greeting. No confirmation. Just 3 words. Delete immediately. No questions. No follow-up. But with her experience handling files that were never meant to exist, Rebecca knew this wasn't about shielding a cop. No one orders a top-down directive in the middle of the night just to bury a punch. This was about protecting the fragile structure of the system from a nationwide cognitive rupture. If that footage were released and the public discovered that a police officer had struck not just a black woman, not just an innocent civilian, but someone involved in a black ops program so covert that even the government knew her only by identifier code, the resulting breach of trust wouldn't just shake the system, it would ignite it. Her hand moved to the mouse. The pointer hovered over the permanent delete button. But just as she prepared to click, a strange line of code appeared in the system log. Phoenix. Do not interrupt unless authorized by program lead. The message flashed in crimson. Auto-logged. Rebecca pushed back from her desk. Heart pounding. She knew the Phoenix program. A name always redacted in documents hidden behind triple encryption. Flagged with level 0 clearance. No one in her office was even allowed to say it out loud. She had assumed it was a failed initiative. Some defunct psychological warfare branch discontinued in the early part of the last decade. But if that name was surfacing now, and if Elisa was tied to it, then keeping or deleting this footage was no longer a choice. It was the line between an agency's survival or its quiet erasure. Rebecca sat still. The monitor remained lit. The clock ticked to 3:27 a.m. She had no more options. She launched a third-tier login request, asking for authentication from the CIA. The system prompted for a reason. She typed, "Validate Alpha 7 security level linked to Phoenix." The system didn't respond. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then 30. Finally, one line appeared. Authentication acknowledged. Do not ask further. Do not proceed further. Then the system went dark. She did not delete the file. But she didn't leave it in any accessible directory either. She placed it in a dead folder, accessible only to those who knew the buried keyword. She didn't do it to rebel. She did it on instinct. Because for the first time, Rebecca understood some secrets aren't hidden to protect the system. They're hidden so no one ever has to witness them. But not everyone is trained to look away from the truth. And sometimes a single gaze captured at the right moment in the right frame by the right quiet observer standing at the edge can ignite an entire system lulled to sleep by its illusion of power. The next morning, as the city still rubbed its eyes awake, a small social media post appeared. No lengthy caption, no video clip, just a single still image taken from a distance. Slightly blurred, but clear enough to see. Elisa Monroe, blood dripping from the corner of her mouth. Head held high, eyes looking straight ahead, not at the lens, but seemingly through the photographer. through the thousands of unseen eyes now staring at the same photo. The uploader was a second-year journalism student who had happened to walk by the scene the day before. Snapping the photo before he even understood what was happening. He didn't record a video. He simply raised his phone on instinct. But when he reviewed it at home, he sensed something off, not in the blood, but in the silence of that stare. A silence more powerful than any scream. He wrote just a few words. She didn't flinch. She remembered. And then, like a spark dropped into gasoline, the post began spreading with a speed no algorithm could contain. Within 6 hours, the image had been shared nearly 500,000 times. Within 12, it appeared on every platform, from local news pages to national influencers. Those who had experienced police brutality recognized that look. Those silenced by the system saw themselves in those eyes. And even people who had never been harmed couldn't look away because the image offered no accusations yet still made them feel complicit. The hashtag who is she surged to the top nationwide within 24 hours. People began digging, speculating, and building theories. A black woman was struck in broad daylight with no record, no identity, yet she stood, stared, and walked away as if she were the one judging those who had attacked her. Photos from the community center were unearthed. Some parents recognized her as the one who taught their children. A few volunteers had pictures from last summer's festival standing next to her. But even those only deepened the mystery. No tags, no real name, no identifying information. She existed like a void, yet one powerful enough to shake every piece of data trying to mask the truth. As traditional media picked up the story, it ceased to be about police violence. It became a question of identity. A question that the longer it went unanswered, the harder it became to look away from. Veteran crisis communication strategists were bewildered. There was no scandal to deny, no doctored video, no false accusation, just a glance, a photograph, and a wave of emotion that could not be manipulated. But what truly shook the system didn't come from social media. It came in the form of an email, an internal memo from the office of the CIA director to the Eastern Strategic Command. Subject line: Phoenix Protocol Review Immediate. Below it was a directive to convene an interagency security review group, including representatives from the NSA, DOD, and DOJ, with a note: Alpha 7 tier acid detected publicly. Risk of civilian destabilization if mishandled. Do not make direct contact with the target. Await instruction from lead program officer. Inside the intelligence community, only a handful even knew what the Phoenix program was, and even fewer understood why it required nearly impenetrable encryption levels. But all of them understood one thing. If someone trained by Phoenix surfaced in public and began exerting influence without control from command, this was not a rogue operative. This was someone who had just chosen to rewrite justice in her language. That sentence echoed like a bell, not loud, but loud enough to unlock the steel doors deep inside Langley, the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency. The meeting was convened urgently. No public notice, no recordings, no internal live feed. 11 people sat around a long stone table in an alpha-level strategic coordination room lined with walls resistant to imaging, frequencies, and heat. Every person at that table had heard of Phoenix, but none had imagined the day would come when one of the program's earliest products would step into the light without glitch, without fear, without evasion, and compel the entire media machine to lean forward and ask, "Who is she?" The director in charge of psychological operations opened the meeting with a question no one wanted to answer. Do we need to retrieve her? The word, retrieve, in CIA language never implied anything gentle. It did not mean an invitation. It did not conjure negotiation. To retrieve meant to erase, to disappear, to be pulled from public life and shoved into a permanent void of classified silence. But this time, the only one authorized to respond was the director of the Phoenix program. A silver-haired woman with an unreadable face who had been tracking Elisa Monroe since she was just a code in a selection report at age 16. She didn't answer immediately. She stared at the large screen where Elisa's viral photograph filled the center. Those eyes, that moment. Then she spoke softly but with finality. No, for the first time. She is choosing her own response. And I want to see what she chooses. A heavy silence settled across the table. A senior FBI agent seated to her left frowned slightly. if she disseminates any programmed intel. Or worse, if she engages the public with the intent to stir. We could lose total operational control. Another voice cut in. This isn't a strategic risk. It's a doctrinal one. If a single individual, unarmed, with no title, without court authority, can exert pressure on the system from the bottom up, then we no longer control the definition of order. The Phoenix director smiled, a weary smile. That's exactly why I want to observe. She hasn't violated any directive. She hasn't leaked classified information. She hasn't committed physical aggression. We built a framework for control. She's using everything we embedded, just not the way we expected. She's doing what none of us ever dared. Outside, the data storm continued to swell. But inside, the CIA chose to remain still. No statements, no denials, no acknowledgments, a strategy of active passivity. One only understood by those who have orchestrated asymmetric warfare. Sometimes non-intervention is the most deliberate tactic. And Elisa, the woman once trained to manipulate foreign heads of state, to infiltrate psychology through gaze, gesture, and memory, was now attacking no one. She simply stepped into the system, stood still, and let it derail itself. Langley does not fear justice. Langley fears losing the monopoly on defining what justice is. And Elisa wasn't dismantling the system. She was forcing it to confront itself bit by bit. The very skills they encoded into her, emotional control, social reflex exploitation, planting doubt, silently injecting questions into others' minds without saying a word, were now being turned back on the architects themselves. And there was nothing they could do to stop her because everything she was doing was perfectly legal. And that, above all, was the most dangerous thing. It wasn't because she resisted. She didn't need to resist. It wasn't because she threatened. She didn't need to threaten. There is no response more terrifying than the calm of someone who was once programmed to become what the system itself dares not name. But not everyone understands that. Kyle Breener, the man who threw the first punch in broad daylight, did not understand. He clung to his fading authority, buried himself in anger, in the righteousness stitched into his uniform. But no matter how he lied to himself, he hadn't slept peacefully since that day Elisa looked back at him. 3 days later, a handwritten note appeared at his doorstep. No envelope, no return address, just one line written in neat, deliberate handwriting, so precise it was unsettling. Meet me tomorrow night if you still want to sleep. No signature, no time, no location, and yet, somehow, he knew exactly where to go. And that chilled him more than any threat he had ever received. He didn't report it, didn't call backup, didn't activate his body cam. He simply went, like a man stepping into his final judgment, not as an officer, not as an authority figure, but as someone who no longer had the right to ask questions. The room where Elisa waited was an abandoned meeting space in an old cultural center on the city's edge. Sliding glass doors, peeling paint, a long wooden table, and 2 chairs facing each other. No harsh lights, no cameras, nothing, only a silence so dense it pressed into the lungs. He entered. She was already seated. No movement, no smile, no coldness, just presence, as if she had never left since the day she was struck. Sit, she said, the first words he'd ever clearly heard from her. Calm, like addressing a child. Kyle sat, shoulders stiff, hands slightly trembling. He tried to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to justify, but before his lips could form the first syllable, she spoke gently, as if reciting a fable. Do you know when I first lost the concept of fear? He said nothing. She didn't expect an answer. Kandahar, she continued, they hung me upside down from a steel beam in a room soaked with heat and blood. They didn't use whips or pliers. They just stared, every day, watching me not eat, not sleep, not die, and then they started to panic, not because I fought back, but because I didn't need to. Kyle clenched his hands on his thighs. No story had ever made his skin go this cold. Elisa continued slowly, like she was recalling a dream from another lifetime. Do you know when a person becomes what others fear most? It's when they no longer need to threaten, no longer need to strike back, when they can simply stand there and let you see yourself so clearly you can't bear it. And you, Kyle, are arriving at that moment. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move, Yet the room seemed to contract with every tick of the wall clock. Each second a knock from another world. He swallowed hard. Sweat soaked his back. His eyes darted for something to grip, a reason, a foothold, a way to push back, but there was nothing. She went quiet for a long time. Then asked, "Do you know why I asked you here?" He didn't answer. She spoke again, barely above a whisper. "Not to scare you, not to retaliate. I came to give you one last chance to truly see yourself." Kyle stood up suddenly, but his legs faltered. He turned to leave. She didn't stop him, didn't look back. She simply said, so softly it nearly dissolved into air, "After tonight, I won't come for you again. I don't have to. What's coming? You'll summon it yourself." Her final words were not a curse. They were a door, quietly opening onto the dusty corridors of memories that were never meant to see light. And in that silent room where Kyle had just left, Elisa remained seated alone. She didn't need to close her eyes to see the fragments. Every piece of memory once thought buried emerged again, neatly preserved, waiting only for someone foolish enough to bring them back to life. Poland, 2012. That was where she first stepped into a world no one gets to walk back out of. The underground training facility for the Phoenix program had no gates, no instructors in white shirts. The ones who taught were men who had eliminated targets not with weapons, but with a sentence. They were psychological warfare specialists who had made foreign leaders resign without ever understanding why their own minds had turned hollow. Elisa was one of 8, selected after a 2-year screening across 5 countries. The criteria weren't IQ. It was a trauma index, children who had lived through injustice but didn't break, who had witnessed cruelty without reacting on instinct, people who could feel deeply without being consumed by emotion, individuals trained not to fight with blood, but with presence so potent it made adversaries hang themselves with their fear. Colombia, Myanmar, Eastern Ukraine. She moved through missions never recorded, never declassified. No one knew her face, but those who encountered her carried a suffocating impression, not from her hand, but from the unseen pressure she merely allowed to exist. She never fired a gun. She didn't need to. Those she approached would withdraw before the system even had to intervene. Collapse always began from within. One glance, one question, one well-timed silence, and entire power structures disintegrated like dust disturbed by a breath. But there was one time. A mission in Yangon. She had been embedded in an observation team to approach a general suspected of organizing a covert civil violence network. Her task wasn't to intervene. It was to distort, to destabilize his faith in the system he controlled. But that day, amid the shouting of protesters, the sting of tear gas, and rocks hurled through the air, a child was trampled. One of her team, Yusuf, moved to rescue the child. Defying orders, Elisa had the authority to signal intervention. But she didn't. She wanted to see what would happen if, just once, she withheld her power. And she watched as Yusuf was beaten to death right before her eyes by agents of the very general she had infiltrated. The child lived, but the one person she trusted most died because she had wanted to see if there was any humanity left in herself. That night, she did not sleep. She did not cry. She did not panic. She sat and stared into a mirror for hours, as if trying to locate within herself some trace of decency she feared she had lost. And she understood then. The most terrifying thing isn't violence. It's power used at the wrong time, for the wrong reason, on the wrong person. From that moment on, Elisa never forgave anyone who used their strength to assert status, regardless of who they were or which side they claimed. Elisa left Phoenix without notice. She didn't flee. She simply disappeared like a ghost who had chosen to no longer serve. But also never turned on her creators. She went to places where no files followed. Cities where people lived through touch, not decrees. She chose places where no one asked where she came from. And when someone did ask what she was, she only said, "I was once chosen, now I choose again." That sentence wasn't merely a declaration. It was the starting point of a chain reaction. But instead of collapsing like a game of dominoes, each block touched by Elisa shifted so suddenly that no one even noticed it had begun to move. Kyle returned from that empty room meeting, feeling as though someone had peeled away the protective skin covering the things he once believed were untouchable. He fell asleep on the sofa, lights still on, door unlocked, and the next morning, Everything looked the same. But then small things began to change, not with loud noises, but with absolute silence. First was his social media account. It wasn't hacked. It wasn't deleted. It was just quietly throttled. Posts still appeared, but no one responded, no likes, no comments. People who used to message him daily suddenly became busy. His girlfriend, who used to text him every morning, went quiet. When Kyle called, she replied curtly, coldly, and hung up. There was no argument, no drama, just the unmistakable sensation that the world itself had begun to tilt away from the axis where you once stood at the center. Next came the bank. He discovered his credit account had been flagged for identity verification. When he called the customer service line, the automated system asked him to hold for 43 minutes with no human ever picking up. His card wasn't blocked, but online transactions failed. Kyle began to feel as though someone had gently run a hand through his data, not erasing it, just dimming it. He didn't know what was happening. He saw no clear signs. But the suffocating pressure, like the air itself was being drained from around him, was undeniable. At noon, he went to the gym as usual, swiped his membership card like always. But the scanner blinked red. The front desk attendant, a cheerful young man who used to chat with him regularly, suddenly turned distant and pointed to a sign. Account temporarily suspended due to unpaid balance. Kyle was stunned. His credit limit was still active, but the system didn't lie. And the way the entire gym turned away from him, as if he had never existed, hit harder than any spoken insult. That night, he went drinking at a familiar bar where the bartender used to have his favorite drink ready the moment he walked in. But this time, no one looked at him. He sat there for 13 minutes, no menu, no greeting. When he finally walked up to the bar, a manager gently stepped over and said, "Sorry, sir, someone else has reserved the seat you're in. Could you please move to the waiting area?" He didn't yell, didn't argue, just nodded like a shadow trying to learn how to exist in an alternate version of reality. As he left, a woman walking past whispered something to her friend, and the two burst out laughing, a laugh with no clear meaning. No defined target, but unmistakably aimed at something contemptible. The next morning, Kyle received an envelope from his company. No logo, no note, just an amendment to his employment contract with a small annotation. Temporary reduction in role during internal review. No accusation, no named complaint, but in the office, no one spoke to him. His computer was taken for system maintenance. A former colleague passed by, glanced, and smirked. Getting used to sitting on the edge of the world yet? He wanted to respond, but no words held enough weight because what was happening wasn't an attack. It was an erasure, a kind of cancellation no one needed to enforce. And then, like the final drop in an already spilling glass, he walked into his usual coffee shop, the place where he used to read the paper each morning and wave for a latte. Like a regular patron, the waitress looked at him like a stranger. "Can I help you?" Her voice flat, eyes emotionless. Kyle forced a weak smile, ordered his usual, but when he pulled out his card, the POS terminal rejected it 3 times in a row. She simply shook her head gently and said the one thing he never thought he'd hear in that place: "Sorry. Looks like there's an issue with your account. We don't accept cash. You might want to call the bank." Behind him, a man waiting for a table scoffed, eyeing Kyle like he was a joke stripped of its punchline. Kyle left, his coffee never made, feeling as if an invisible layer of dust had settled over his name. He returned to his apartment, hands trembling as he opened the door, and noticed that the newspaper, normally placed neatly on his doorstep, had been blown about by the wind, no one bothering to pick it up. A torn scrap clung to his ankle. The headline smudged, "How do we deal with evil when it wears a suit and knows how to smile?" Kyle didn't know who wrote it, didn't know which paper it came from, but the question pierced his chest, not with logic, but with the quiet recognition that life itself was stepping away from him. Like the tide silently launching an old, decaying ship, Kyle stood motionless in the hallway, the dim light stretching his shadow into something long and ragged, like a condemned figure laid bare, though no one needed to explain why. And that feeling, not being condemned yet not being forgiven either, was what was tearing him apart from the inside out. People Kyle used to know started avoiding him. A former coworker declined a coffee invitation. A fellow officer who had once patrolled the streets with him turned quickly away when he saw Kyle in the supermarket. No one said a word, but that silence held more weight than any accusation. Kyle tried to find a reason, scouring the internet, searching for news, asking the few remaining friends he had left. But the more he asked, the farther people pulled away. And in those moments when he sat alone, staring at a blank screen, Kyle began to understand. No one needed Elisa to touch him ever again. She didn't have to do a thing. All she had to do was let him face himself. And that alone was enough for everything to start unraveling from within. He tried to hold on, tried to speak up, posting a video explaining that people misunderstood, that there were different perspectives, that he was just doing his job. But that voice, that face, those eyes, once captured in a close-up by a bystander on that day, now became the very reason people grew angrier. They didn't want explanations. They only saw a man hitting a woman who did not fight back. And worse, he had no idea who he was without the power to do exactly that. The video lasted 30 minutes before being labeled as incendiary content, not deleted. Just restricted. The view count stayed frozen. No shares. But in the comment section, each word cut like a blade. You don't need to justify. You need to disappear. A verified account, a local journalist, left a single sentence. A slap can't be erased with an apology. Another user posted a screenshot of the moment Kyle grabbed Elisa by the shoulder with a mocking caption. He thought he was the law. But the law can't save him from his own reflection. The next day, Kyle's car door was smeared with black paint, no symbol, no writing, just a thick streak like a bruise spreading from the handle. He washed it off. Tried to forget, but when he went to his usual auto shop, the owner, the man who had once drunk beer with him, stood at a distance and said, "Not taking appointments today." Kyle asked why. The man only shrugged. "I don't want to be in the paper." The words were not hostile, but they carried the weight of a blade long sharpened. Kyle turned away, trying to keep his posture, but everyone could see he was no longer walking, just drifting through a city that no longer saw him as part of it. At night, Kyle tried logging back into the police forum, a place once filled with brotherhood, where he shared field stories, drank virtual beers, and laughed during private live streams. His account still existed, but no one replied to his new post. He sent a private message to someone who once called him brother, asking, "What's going on?" The message was seen but never answered. 10 minutes later, he was kicked out of the group. No notice, no explanation. Just the name Kyle R vanished as if it had never existed. And in that moment, he understood. No one banned him from showing up. People just no longer found his presence necessary. One morning, Kyle headed to the nearby grocery store. The lights were on, no closed sign, but when he stepped inside, the bell gave a soft chime, and the cashier quietly turned her back. No one came to the counter. No one spoke. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. Eventually, a middle-aged woman with a staff badge walked out behind the counter. Never looking at him, placing a small sign on the desk, "System Maintenance. No service at this time." As he walked out, still clutching a small bill in his hand, a young boy standing by the entrance stared at him, then turned to his mother and asked, "Mom, is that the man from the video?" A child's question, but sharper than any indictment. The mother gripped her son's hand without answering, pulling him away, leaving Kyle behind in the sound of the glass door closing, not loud, not harsh, but suffocating. Days passed as though every door slowly closed in his face. No one screamed, no one cursed, but every gaze dodged him as if the name Kyle carried the scent of a curse. Once, he went to the park and sat on a familiar stone bench, trying to find a sliver of peace. But before he could speak, a young woman walking her dog pulled the leash tight and stared at him. When he said, "I'm just sitting here," she cut in softly, "I know, but you're not allowed to sit here anymore." Her voice wasn't raised, but it was final. No police, no written rule, but also no space for him. And so, in the days that followed, when he opened his eyes each morning, it wasn't sunlight that woke Kyle, but the feeling of being skinned by society, not with torture, not with violence, but with 1,000 small cuts, the averted glances, the deleted messages, the invitations that never came. and the loneliness that had shape, sound, and even the scent of cold metal threading through crowds who once called him by rank. But now, no titles echoed back, only a man who once had authority, a place, a voice, and was now learning to remain silent in a world that chose to erase him without even saying his name. Not long after, he was invited for an interview by a media outlet, not to clear his name, but to hear the perspective from the other side. But the moment he stepped into the studio, the crew sneered and asked, "Are you planning to say, 'I was misunderstood'? Because we've prepared a counter for how many times cops have said that line." They didn't yell, didn't threaten, but the venom was neatly packaged inside questions that sounded objective, making him feel like he was being torn apart piece by piece in a room where no one laid a hand on his body. In the end, the recording was cut short due to lack of analytical depth. But a short clip got leaked with a caption, "When ego outweighs justice." This is what's left, currently donating to a charity organization in hopes of salvaging his image. But the confirmation email clearly stated, "We appreciate your goodwill, but at this time, the organization cannot accept anonymous contributions from individuals associated with public controversies." His name didn't have to be mentioned. People only needed to know he was the man in the video. And when he walked past a t-shirt printing shop and saw a shirt displayed out front, featuring the silhouette of a man raising his hand to slap, with a caption underneath, "You are not the law. You're just loud," he froze, not out of anger, but because for the first time, he realized his own image had slipped out of his control long ago. And somewhere, captured in the corner of a security camera at an old cafe, Elisa sat in the distance looking at her phone screen, her gaze neither triumphant nor vengeful, just the calm stillness of someone who understood that justice does not need to take the shape of punishment. It only needs to reveal. And when a person is forced to confront the darkest part of themselves, that clarity alone is enough to destroy. But Kyle wasn't the only one pulled into the orbit of that gaze. There was no new hashtag launched, no boycott campaign initiated, no protests were organized with signs bearing his name. But one by one, each person, each voice, each buried memory began rising to the surface, as if an entire community suddenly remembered something they had once been forced to forget. A young mother living in the southern district of the city was playing with her child one evening when she came across a random post featuring a photo of Kyle. She froze for a few seconds, then turned to her husband and said, "That's him, it's him, the one who humiliated me in front of our daughter when I was stuck on the roadside. He yelled in my face and made me kneel to apologize for wasting police time." The husband didn't ask further. He simply sat up straight, opened his phone, and began typing a post. Perhaps in another space, it would have passed like a breeze in the night. But not this time, because another woman, working the night shift as a cashier at a convenience store, read that post during her break and froze behind the counter. She couldn't recall Kyle's name clearly, but she remembered precisely the feeling when he jabbed the tip of a pen into her forehead and barked, "Say my name properly," after she mispronounced his last name while handing over the receipt. A small act, seemingly meaningless, but it kept her awake for a week afterward, afraid of repeating the mistake, afraid of seeing him again, afraid of feeling less than human. That night, she wrote nothing. She just quietly shared the young mother's post and left a single line, "I know how you feel." The resonance didn't begin with arguments. It began with emotion. And from there, a medical student who had once been pulled out of a university library and handcuffed by Kyle for walking the wrong direction as the police car approached posted a video recounting the incident. His eyes neither angry nor teary, but cold and precise, like the incision of someone trained in anatomy. He said, "I thought I was an exception, but now I realize I was just a tiny dot in a dataset that never made it to print." The video was under 2 minutes long, yet shared over 500,000 times within a day. Not because the student was influential, but because everyone saw a piece of themselves in it. At the same time, a long-forgotten community forum where people used to post about lost dogs, missing items, or shift trades suddenly featured a post with a chilling title, "Kyle R. Veteran Officer," or "Specialist in Humiliating the Vulnerable." Below it were hundreds of comments. Some recounted being pulled over without cause. Others described being forced to sign blank citations under high-beam headlights. No one called for attacks. They simply told their stories. But together, these accounts became a prosecution without a lawyer. And none of them hesitated to name him anymore. An unexpected ripple spread to the teaching community when a middle school teacher, who had once taken students on a field trip only to be ordered by Kyle to disperse due to lack of a group permit, posted an old photo of her teacher badge thrown into the mud by him. The caption read, "That year, I didn't cry because I was insulted. I cried because my students saw it happen." Immediately, former students flooded the comments. One writing, "I used to think you were weak. Now I see you were just wounded too early by the system." The muddy badge photo became the profile picture of an online campaign called, "We Remember the Quiet Ones," where victims recounted every small moment, not loud, not violent, when they were treated like objects in the hands of someone labeled a law enforcer. A chain of coffee shops near the police station where Kyle once worked quietly removed the discount tags once reserved for officers in the area. No explanation was given, but on a notice taped to the counter, someone had handwritten in red ink, "Respect cannot be demanded. It must be planted from trust, not fear." That small act was picked up by the local newspaper, accompanied by a headline that read, "Even a cup of coffee knows when to refuse coercion." A group of street artists who usually painted landscape murals suddenly unveiled a new piece. A half-portrait of Kyle, his face turned in profile. But instead of light cast from the front, his features were submerged in shadow. Beside him, the words read, "When power no longer reflects the image of humanity, it becomes a monster." The mural spread across social media at breakneck speed, not because of its artistic merit, but because people recognized that expression not from a movie, but from real life on a real face in the very neighborhoods they lived in. No one forbade him from walking the streets. No one threatened his life. But Kyle knew, as clearly as a reflection in glass, that from now on, every step he took would pass through streets that no longer patted his back because of rank, but would instead whisper behind him in the flat voice of memory, "I've met you before. You pinned me to the ground without asking why." And he also knew, once community memory is unlocked, it does not return to slumber simply because he hides. And as everything began to form on its own, retell itself, spread like oil across water, Kyle understood that there are truths which don't need proof, only reminders. And those who seemed to have forgotten were now the strongest witnesses to the thing he always tried to bury. Wounds that didn't bleed, but left scars all the same. The air thickened like a storm building beneath the surface. And then a seemingly random detail became the final spark. A middle-aged man, once a high school gym teacher in the suburbs, spoke up. He no longer taught, suspended for disturbing law enforcement during a traffic stop 7 years ago. No one believed him at the time because he had no video, no witness, only a complaint filed against Kyle that was handled internally. But when he saw Kyle's face in the viral news footage, he reposted a scan of that scratched-out report with a short note. "I stayed silent because I thought no one would care. Turns out I just had to wait until everyone saw together." And then, like a sudden reversal, a wave of others spoke up. No one called them to action. No one led the charge. But Kyle's sudden reappearance in the news, not for any achievement, but simply because of a silent look from the woman he had struck, was enough to unlock collective memory. They began to remember, no longer afraid, no longer needing evidence, just telling the story, a line, a paragraph, a moment, then leaving it for others to pick up and continue. Not everyone who had been hurt by Kyle had proof. Many only had memories. But when those memories were laid side by side, no investigator was needed to see the common pattern. A subtle abuse of power cloaked in the fabric of duty. Victims are not listed in reports. Wounds are not documented in medical records. But all share the same feeling that someone had passed through their lives and left a cut no one ever bothered to hear until now. The posts spread slowly, not explosively, but steadily. Some were written in a gentle tone, as if finally releasing a weight they had carried for 5 years. Others came through in anger, in choked pain, but without needing condemnation. They weren't trying to convince anyone. They just needed to speak. And strangely, with each new post, there were no arguments, no denials, as if the entire community, through an unspoken consensus, understood that these stories needed to exist. A woman who had once worked on the city council, fired for lack of cooperation during a traffic stop conducted by Kyle. Now shared that when she asked why her car was being searched, Kyle had leaned in and whispered in her ear in public, "I don't need a reason. I just need you to be scared." That story, told in a simple video with no background music, no clickbait title, drew more than 7 million views in 48 hours, not because it was rare, but because it resembled what so many had felt, but never known how to name. An older white man, a former firefighter, shared that he once intervened when he saw Kyle point a gun at a teenager who was merely pulling a phone from his pocket. No one was shot, but the next day, the man was stopped on his way to work and given a blood alcohol test despite not having had a single drink. The officer who filed the report, "Still Kyle, I thought it was a coincidence." He wrote, "Now I know I was targeted simply because I didn't stay quiet." The post was reshared by a group of retired officers with the caption, "A good man does not protect the wrong." Even stories once dismissed as trivial were no longer overlooked. A teenage girl recounted the first time she drove alone, only to be pulled over by Kyle in the middle of the road simply because her car looked like it might have been stolen. He didn't hit her, didn't curse, didn't write a ticket. He just said, "You should be grateful I'm not like the others." That sentence, seemingly unverifiable, became the focus of hundreds of comments because someone, somewhere else, had heard those exact same words from the same man. An Indian American university professor, once stopped by Kyle and searched right outside his campus entrance for walking too slowly near a police vehicle, uploaded security footage from that day. He had filed a complaint the previous year, only to receive a response that no misconduct was found. Now the video spread like wildfire, needing no narration. A middle-aged man being forced against a wall simply for not turning his head fast enough. And Kyle's eyes, clear as noonday sun, bore no trace of duty, only the cold curiosity of a man measuring the fear in his prey's gaze. A young woman working in tech recalled the day Kyle held her after hours for not carrying identification. He asked, "Someone like you works there?" When she reacted, he laughed and added, "I thought that place hired real people." She had stayed silent for years. But today she spoke, not for revenge, but because her younger sister had just landed an internship at the same company. And she didn't want the girl to believe that silence was the only way to keep a job. A group of former college students, once called a pack of annoying kids by Kyle during a bar inspection operation, created an Instagram account titled Voice of the Silenced. There, they posted short recollections, no rants, no complaints, just snippets of severed memories typed over a white background, the name of the bar, the year it happened, the words Kyle had said, and the lingering feeling that followed. Each post was a shard of memory pieced together like fragments of a broken mirror, revealing the true face of someone who once wore a cap, carried a badge, and was called a law enforcer. On a talk show, a black comedian known for sketches about racial profiling unexpectedly said, "There's an officer named Kyle. I met him once. I'm not joking when I say he thought his gun was a microphone. And every time he pulled it out, it was his way of performing fear." The audience burst into laughter, but the host paused for a few seconds, then asked, "Are you sure it was that Kyle?" The comedian nodded, eyes now void of humor. "Yes, I'm sure. And I still have the ridiculous ticket he gave me that day for laughing too loudly." A regional supermarket chain, once under contract with the precinct where Kyle worked, quietly issued a statement ending the partnership due to concerns over brand association with inappropriate behavior by certain individuals in the force. No names were mentioned, but everyone understood, and as the posts continued to appear, no one asked, "Is it true?" Because the community had moved beyond doubt. They had entered the phase of remembering each glance, each word, each breathless moment of humiliation with no one to defend them. And in this rising tide of unnamed memory, each sentence began to carry more weight than any official report. Each short video, each faded photo, each simple anecdote, they all began to connect like a social nervous system waking up at once, sending signals of a pain that had never been treated, but was now being heard. There were even those who had never been directly harmed by Kyle, yet remembered the moments they saw him pass by, heard one shout too loud, witnessed an expression that needed no words to reveal its contempt. An independent cameraman recalled being blocked by Kyle at a fire scene for causing disruption. Despite standing behind the legal barrier tape, when he said he had a press badge, Kyle looked straight into the camera and said, "Record it, let's see who they believe more." That footage, once buried because no one dared air it, was now being reshared, and this time, no one doubted it. A group of students who had once taken part in a city-run communication with police training program began posting their old notes, including quotes Kyle had said jokingly, such as, "Sometimes all you need is a louder voice to get things done," or, "Don't hope for fairness in the law. Just hope you don't piss off the guy with the gun." These notes had once seemed harmless, but now, laid out together, they exposed an ideology many had sensed vaguely, now verified by the very words of the man who once held power. A sociology lecturer quoted these lines in an open online class, accompanied by a single description. "This is how power learns to twist a joke to muffle the sound of a baton strike." A phone shop owner who usually paid little attention to social media spoke up after seeing Kyle's face in a viral clip. "He never hit me, but I once saw him smash a phone right in front of me." Then turn to the victim and say, "Be grateful I didn't smash your face instead." That incident was never written up. There was no video, no evidence, just 3 customers in the store that day, and all of them remembered. Now, all 3 left confirming comments under the post, as if the silence they had swallowed back then had finally found a way to crawl out of their throats. A young author, once rejected by publishers for portraying law enforcement in a negative light, reposted an old chapter of hers where the antagonist was named Kyle. Wore a cap, smirked constantly, and liked to say, "Do you know who I am?" The post gained over 300,000 shares in one evening, not because the prose was extraordinary, but because people realized they had heard those exact words in real life. One reader commented, "I heard that line right before I was dragged out of my car without being allowed to ask why." Another replied, "That line isn't fiction, it's memory." Kyle, meanwhile, still didn't understand what was happening. He read each post, tried to remember faces, situations, denied them, then doubted himself. He thought of posting a clarification but deleted it halfway. He considered calling the police department, but the line rang and then went dead. No one came forward to formally accuse him. But the terrifying part was that no one needed to anymore. The sentence didn't need a lawyer or a courtroom. It appeared in the indifferent glance of a cafe barista when he walked in, in the silent eyes of the elderly woman behind him at the grocery store, in the way a child stopped playing when his mother softly said, "That's the man from the photo." A delivery worker stood frozen on the porch when Kyle opened the door, not from fear, but because years ago, Kyle had shoved him to the ground for stopping in the wrong spot outside the precinct. The man said nothing, just set the package down and turned away. But before stepping off the porch, he turned back, looked Kyle straight in the eyes, and asked softly, "What does it feel like to be judged solely by the uniform you wear?" No threats, no insults, just a reflection, a small role reversal, but enough to dry Kyle's throat completely. At the barbershop he used to visit every weekend, his familiar chair was no longer reserved. When he walked in, no one said, "Hey, Kyle," like before. The main barber looked up briefly, then turned away and called out, "Fully booked today, try next week." No one forbade him from sitting down, but everyone avoided looking at the mirror, where his reflection no longer carried the glow of authority, but the shadow of a man who no longer belonged to the very community he once walked through. As if above it, there are responses that require no words. There are expulsions that need no banners. And Elisa, still sitting in the community center, still teaching children with her hands, her eyes, her quiet presence, didn't have to do anything else. She wasn't the one who mobilized it, but she was the starting point, the reason why all the unspoken things suddenly found a voice. And that is the real power, not to make people act, but to make them unable to stay silent any longer. Amid the wildfire of testimonies, edited clips, commentary threads, speculation storms, call-outs, and cross-polar arguments, Elisa remained silent. She didn't post, she didn't share, she didn't respond. She never appeared in any footage beyond old photos others had circulated without permission. Despite journalists knocking, networks sending exclusive offers, and influencers pleading for just a few words. She never answered, not out of fear, but because she knew that some truths grow fainter the more they're spoken. And some truths echo loudest when left untouched. Instead of stepping into the spotlight, Elisa became a void, but it was the kind of void that cameras couldn't stop gravitating toward. Each time she declined to comment, search trends on her name spiked. Each time someone said she should speak up, hundreds replied, "She already is," by staying silent. A video of her quietly kneeling to tie the shoelaces of a disabled child outside the community center went viral overnight, reaching over 3 million views. The caption read, "The ones who don't prove themselves are the ones with nothing left to prove." The less she spoke, the more she was heard. Her absence created a distance between her and the institutions that once believed they controlled every narrative. On a private forum, an anonymous account claiming to be a former rapid response officer disclosed that Elisa had once been offered a high-level regional security advisory role but declined, saying, "I can't draw maps for those who treat the compass as a privilege." The quote was unverified, but it quickly spread, printed on T-shirts, used as profile banners, and cited in internal discussions within watchdog groups. The explosion wasn't only public. Inside government offices, the temperature shifted. A clerk who once handled Kyle's internal file anonymously mailed a letter to a local court, revealing he had been ordered to delete an audio recording of a black woman trying to report Kyle for threats 3 years ago. The recording no longer existed, but the letter, posted on a prominent legal blog, was shared by more than 10,000 people overnight with the caption, "No records remain, but the memories will not vanish this time." No one summoned Elisa to appear, but everywhere she was absent became sharply visible. In a training session on law enforcement ethics at the Federal Enforcement Academy, an unexplained slide appeared. No title, no name, just a grainy image of her walking away from the center's courtyard. A single line underneath, "She walked away." And everything followed. No instructor claimed it, no student objected, and no one removed it. That same day, a closed-door meeting took place in a basement room of a government building, the kind used for unrecorded internal reviews. Elisa had been invited by a senior member of the Police Oversight Committee, not through official channels, but via a handwritten note that read, "If you want to speak, this is the only room where no one will cut you off." She came. No bodyguards, no suit, no briefcase. She entered like a late guest to a nameless hearing. 8 people were already seated. No introductions, no camera, no stenographer, but their eyes revealed everything. They had read, they had watched, they had followed, and they were waiting for something to make their simmering discomfort official. Elisa sat, hands resting on the table, eyes steady, no makeup, no dramatization. She brought no papers. When asked if she had anything to say, she spoke one sentence, soft, unraised, unembellished, but it brought the entire room to a breathless halt. "He wasn't afraid of being struck back. He was afraid because I didn't need to strike." No immediate response followed. No one had expected that what they came for, a fiery statement, a public condemnation, a speech of moral power, would arrive as something so unassuming and razor-sharp. It wasn't an indictment. It wasn't statistics. It was a whisper that shattered the very structure of retribution. The leather chairs seemed to exhale. A legal expert across the table instinctively pulled out her pen but didn't write. Instead, she stared at her palm, as if realizing for the first time that the laws she had helped draft defined limits clearly but had never imagined a form of justice that existed beyond them, where fear wasn't managed by force, but by presence. A younger committee member, hair cropped short, tie a muted gray, cleared his throat. His voice wavered somewhere between authority and confusion. "You don't want legal action. You don't want him held accountable." Elisa looked straight at him, not defiantly, not with accusation, but with the clarity of someone who had long outpaced the contours of legal frameworks. What measure of accountability could define the fear of a man forced to face the filth within himself? "I don't need to bring him down. I only need to stand still so he can see. For the first time, there's nowhere left to hide." Her words weren't loud, but they seeped into every crevice of silence. Someone shifted in their seat, attempting to mask a shiver. An official folded his hands, tapping a finger nervously against the table's edge, as if trying to brush away the weight of helplessness. There were no recordings, no cameras, but everyone knew what she had said would never be documented, yet would never be forgotten. One man in the corner, a former legal advisor for tactical operations, pulled out his phone, not to record, but to revisit an old report he had authored. It contained the line, "Case Kyle B. Insufficient grounds for investigation." Reading it again felt like measuring darkness with a ruler. Silence stretched, not awkward, not empty, but dense. Outside, someone closed a hallway window. The sound slipped into the room like punctuation. No one mentioned Kyle again. No one used terms like psychological impact or unforeseen behavioral patterns. Those were shields, and now truth stood too close to duck behind them. Then came something unplanned. The oversight chair, who had led an 18-month inquiry into police ethics, leaned back, removed his glasses, and murmured, "You don't need to do anything." "But maybe we do." No one answered, not in agreement, not in debate, because no words remained that could follow such a statement without dulling its edge. There was no vote, no formal consensus, but the meeting ceased to be procedural and became personal, not with Elisa, but with each person's quiet reckoning. They all understood this could no longer be called a hearing because the only person who brought truth into the room needed no validation, no defense, no campaign. The room fell silent. No one said another word because the answer, unwritten, unstated, was irrefutable. And outside, Elisa's words began to circulate across the web like a trigger phrase. A law student wrote them on a sticky note and placed it on her laptop. A media director included it in an internal email. Understand this before you talk about brand image. A high school civics teacher, once suspended for criticizing police conduct, wrote it in chalk across the blackboard. No context, no discussion. The class sat in silence for 10 minutes. And when a single father in the suburbs, once threatened by Kyle for asking about a vehicle search, posted the quote alongside a photo of his son reading it on screen. The post garnered millions of interactions. Not because of cinematics, but because of the boy's eyes, confused, awakening, as if for the first time he realized some things don't need to be shouted to terrify. And some truths only appear when the world quiets down long enough to see them. Back in the basement room, silence was no longer a symptom of powerlessness. It became a skin around things that had never been touched. A former officer, nearly 3 decades in the field, looked at Elisa as if seeing himself from years ago in a different case with a different victim. Where he had once turned away, thinking silence was neutrality, he knew better now. Silence is never neutral. It always sides with someone. And if not chosen carefully, it betrays what one once believed was right. No one retracted a question. No one corrected her response. But when Elisa stood, gently pushed in her chair, and walked out without another word, 3 of the 8 remaining members reopened closed cases marked insufficient grounds. For the first time in years, someone said, "We need to go through everyone." Yes, even the ones already signed off. No one nodded, but no one objected. That silent agreement didn't need a record. It had already been signed by a shared glance that had reached the floor of their integrity. Change hadn't begun with a ruling. It had begun with a shedding. And when someone lets go of the need to win, to be believed, or to be celebrated, what remains is the true weight of who they are. Elisa never demanded justice, and because of that, what she delivered could not be named by any existing term in the dictionary of law. They would have to write a new one. The room stayed quiet. No one said another word because that answer couldn't be argued. It didn't live within legal frameworks. It couldn't be transcribed. But they all understood. They understood why Elisa didn't need a broadcast to have influence. They understood why a single glance captured in a photo carried more weight than 1,000 news segments. And they understood that from this moment forward, this wasn't just a special case. It was a turning point, an awakening. It didn't begin with an explosion. It began with a silence that could no longer be ignored. And that silence, as if carrying the weight of an unspoken verdict, started knocking on doors that once believed themselves safe from being touched. While Elisa returned to her quiet rhythm with the children, on the opposite side of the chessboard, another name began appearing in internal investigation reports. Rebecca Lynn. Rebecca was not surprised when she received the summons. She had known it would come. Ever since her finger paused before the warning line, "Phoenix, do not interrupt," she understood that every move thereafter, whether action or inaction, would be scrutinized. She did not delete the footage, but she did hide it. She did not distribute it, but she also failed to report it. And when the internal disciplinary committee summoned her, she did not make excuses. She sat up straight, eyes unflinching, and answered each question in a voice so calm it unsettled the room. "You understand that concealing the video is a serious breach of evidence handling protocol, don't you?" the chairman asked. Rebecca nodded. "I do." "Then why did you do it?" Rebecca did not answer immediately. She looked straight at her interrogator slowly, as if carefully choosing each word to avoid straying from the core. "I was afraid." The room fell silent. No one expected someone seasoned in data security to offer such an emotional reply. They anticipated technical reasoning, procedural loopholes, some kind of systemic excuse. But Rebecca spoke only one truth. "I was afraid, not of her, but that the system would not survive if the public found out we had ever beaten her." Someone in the room furrowed their brow, as if still disbelieving what they heard. But no one objected because something unspoken began to spread after her words, not regret, but an acknowledgement of a fear many in the room had felt but never dared to name. No one asked her where the footage currently was. They didn't need to because they knew if Rebecca had wanted to destroy it, it would have vanished the first night. The fact that it still existed, albeit hidden, was an unspoken declaration. "I didn't save her. I only let the truth have a chance to survive." A lawyer on the internal audit team placed both hands on the table. The wristwatch he wore still stained with red ink from a prior meeting, and asked in a low but firm voice, "Are you aware that you violated data seal protocols?" Rebecca nodded. "I didn't violate the seal. I just didn't label it in time." "Are you playing word games?" "I'm trying to leave enough space for my conscience to remain." Others might have called that a justification, but no one in the room laughed because what Rebecca said, though it defied process, was chillingly logical in human terms. A kind of reason that the system had never trained them to handle. Tensions rose when an internal email leaked with a subject line bearing an emergency directive: "Delete all clips from file 14.3. Priority 3. Wipe." Sent by the deputy technical supervisor of Rebecca's division. The email lacked a signature, but the IP trace matched his office precisely during the window when Rebecca was under investigation. The matter remained unverified, but the leak spread rapidly online as proof that not only Rebecca, but the system itself, was biting into its own shoulder to cover a long festering wound. In a separate development, a former security engineer who once worked with Rebecca spoke out on a podcast, recounting a conversation with her months prior to the incident. "She once asked me if a piece of data could save an entire generation from false beliefs but threaten the survival of a power structure. Should it be kept or deleted? What did you answer?" I asked back. "Who owns that data?" She said, "It belongs to no one. But the consequences of burying it belong to everyone." The hearing did not end in dispute, but it left behind a silence, not the silence of people scrambling to escape blame, but the silence of those looking for the first time into a void they themselves helped to create. Rebecca didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She didn't seek forgiveness. Nor did she pretend to. The woman facing her, the legal representative of the board, after nearly 20 minutes without speaking, said only one sentence: "We will have to record your failure to disclose the footage as a serious violation." Rebecca nodded. "Recording is your job. Remembering is mine." Then she leaned slightly forward, quietly adding a sentence absent from any official record but echoing like a frozen indictment: "You're investigating me for not deleting it. But no one has investigated why it existed in the first place." No one replied. No one looked at each other. And no one denied it. Because in that moment, her words became the final accusation the system had no way of erasing from memory. There is no indictment greater than a confession like that because it wasn't aimed at an individual. It was aimed at an entire structure on the verge of collapse under the weight of its own deception. Rebecca didn't weep, didn't tremble. She accepted every charge, requested no leniency, made no appeal to circumstance. She knew clearly her role was neither culprit nor victim. She was a single link. And in one moment, that link chose to let the system glimpse itself. Someone on the board flipped through the file in front of them. pretending to review it one more time in search of a technicality that might blunt the impact of her words. But no one dared to speak again. They couldn't because her clarity and brevity stripped away their ability to refute. In a private security group within the investigative agency, a transcript of Rebecca's testimony leaked within 12 hours, cited by more than 30 independent outlets with the headline, "I was afraid the system wouldn't survive if the public knew." That statement didn't just ignite the media. It appeared in a video analysis by a criminology professor who declared, "This isn't a rebellion. It's a confession powerful enough to unsettle the core mechanics of law enforcement oversight." Within less than 24 hours, several government websites were flooded with questions. How many other videos have been buried? An investigative journalist from Chicago released a series of documents revealing that Rebecca had been secretly suspended for 1 week after submitting a report proposing a review of the private body cam storage system, a report never made public but bearing the approval signature of a deputy director still in office. No official confirmed it, but from that moment forward, the board knew this story had moved beyond individual misconduct. In response, technical departments across other agencies suddenly received orders to audit their entire footage archives from the past 2 years. They called it a routine inspection. But the tech staff themselves took screenshots of the orders and posted them online with sarcastic captions, "Too coincidental to be a coincidence." An anonymous technician from Texas submitted a 30,000-word exposé to a local newsroom, detailing the routine verbal orders for data deletion often used in potentially controversial scenarios. Though unverified, the article was shared over 1 million times in 2 days. Rebecca said no more, but her silence echoed through blog posts by former investigators forced into retirement, through podcasts discussing the public's right to know, even through videos of law students standing in lecture hall corridors, reciting her testimony like a new manifesto on the boundary between ethics and technology. The board didn't know what to do with her testimony. Discipline, possibly prosecution, was difficult. She hadn't leaked the footage, hadn't distributed it, hadn't manipulated any data, but she also hadn't followed protocol. Rebecca stood in a gray zone with no clear provision for resolution. And that forced everyone to re-evaluate the process, to re-evaluate themselves. She wasn't a whistleblower, but her action, or inaction, shook the entire apparatus because after she was summoned, it wasn't just one video that got reopened. It was the entire system beginning to search for what it had once tried so hard to blur. And within that silent movement, a question began to emerge clearer than any piece of evidence. Why could one ordinary person, unarmed, without a title, not involved in media, not appearing in public, cause an entire structure of power to tremble? That question wasn't asked in news broadcasts nor in government meetings but originated from a group of independent critical scholars who had spent years studying the impact of non-institutional power in modern society. In a memo addressed internally to the Judicial Committee, they wrote, "We are witnessing a phenomenon that cannot be measured by media metrics or levels of violence. This is the first recorded case where a single individual, by pure presence and minimal speech, has forced an entire system to pause and self-interrogate." According to them, this wasn't the reaction of a system caught doing wrong. It was the reaction of a system caught deceiving itself. Shortly after the memo leaked, a video clip of less than 30 seconds showing Elisa standing still in the courtyard of the community center began spreading at an astonishing rate. No dialogue, no effects, just a single static frame in which the crowd surrounding her blurred as if time had stopped. The subtitle read, "She held no power yet made power stop." Within 48 hours, the video was shared by hundreds of influential figures from law, education, and politics, not as part of a coordinated trend, but as if each of them needed to prove to themselves that they could still recognize the truth. They called it the Monroe Effect, a form of collective psychological disruption when members within a system are forced to face the truth delivered by someone outside the chain of command. Elisa Monroe didn't need to raise her voice. The very fact that she didn't have to speak made every word she chose to utter impossible to ignore. And because she belonged to no organization, held no political alignment, and represented no interest group, the entire system found itself unable to neutralize her the way it would any typical dissident. A former communications strategist who had served under 3 administrations wrote on a private forum, "They can't make her a symbol because she won't allow it. And they can't make her a rebel because she hasn't broken a single rule they can exploit. The comment was quickly screenshotted, shared, and later cited in academic panels as a rare case study of unpositioned power. A type of influence that a system cannot co-opt, distort, or absorb. In an emergency meeting at the Office of Government Counsel, one member raised the question: if someone without a title can destabilize the entire structure, has the system placed too much faith in its ability to self-regulate? No one answered, but in the aftermath, a flood of internal emails across regulatory agencies began, including response procedures to extrastructural factors. No one stated outright that Elisa was the target, but all guidance materials began referencing examples with eerily matching characteristics: unaffiliated individuals. No official statements, no legal demands, yet still capable of triggering uncontrollable social effects. An editorial in a public policy journal described the current moment with a biting metaphor: a fortress built on laws, orders, and power, now being reinforced simply because one woman stood still and made everyone listen. And when a journalism student titled their thesis, "Constructive Silence, Analyzing the Monroe Effect in Contemporary Media Structures," it was the very professors, once considered architects of communication theory for the next generation, who had to admit they had never encountered a phenomenon that so completely challenged the notion of institutional power. Elisa did not join the debate. She did not ask to be quoted. Yet her name slipped into hearings as a reference case, appeared in proposals to revise oversight protocols, and became the anonymous figure cited by politicians eager to prove they were listening to voices outside the system. When a former Security Council member stated during an interview, "Without structure, she would have no power," a viral video remix juxtaposed his claim with footage of Elisa refusing to answer press questions. Overdubbed with his own voice from a decade-old scandal, "Real power needs no one to grant it." The video reached 20 million views within a single day and was simply titled, "The Mirror Returns." An ordinary person, if they understand the system better than the system understands itself, becomes something no regulatory mechanism can contain. That is what internal reports began to accept, though no one said it aloud. What Elisa did was not on any crisis management checklist. She didn't break the rules, didn't incite, didn't attack. She merely stood in the light and let the system look at itself and see the cracks that had long existed without anyone needing to strike the first blow. In an unclassified document leaked from the Department of Homeland Security, a crossed-out assessment was discovered before official submission: she is the still point. But the social reactions around her ripple like an earthquake. The more she remains motionless, the greater the resonance. It was precisely that stillness, no subpoenas, no calls to action, that unsettled the system. A social media analysis conducted by the agency's Media Signal Monitoring Unit recorded over 85,000 discussions about Elisa within 10 days. Most not focused on any specific statement she had made, but circling around a singular question: why does she not need to say anything for everyone to listen? No one can confront a mirror. And Elisa was that mirror, not distorted, not screaming, not twisting reality, just reflecting. But when a system accustomed to living in darkness is forced to see itself in the light, what it sees is not itself. It sees itself. And that reflection, in the moment of facing the truth, is what makes them tremble. A former federal judge interviewed on an independent program admitted during the conversation: "What unnerves me is not what she says, but that I can't find a single argument strong enough to counter her." That clip, once uploaded, was transformed into a meme that spread widely. His face placed beside an image of Elisa walking away from the camera with the caption: "Silence is a kind of authority the law did not anticipate." Mainstream outlets did not reprint it, but reposts on independent platforms surpassed 12 million impressions in 48 hours. Traditional media struggled to define Elisa. Calling her a spokesperson was incorrect as she represented no one. Labeling her a central victim was inaccurate since she refused that role. A news channel branded her a moral influencer, sparking backlash. During an academic forum, a researcher proposed a chilling term: the undefinable agent. If influence could exist without definition, then frameworks designed to control became obsolete. Inside regulatory agencies, silent, off-record meetings occurred. An email from a legal director, later leaked, stated, "If one person can disrupt a protocol by doing nothing, Perhaps the protocol was flawed from the start. That email, deleted within 3 hours, circulated as a case study in academic circles on ripple effects. A university included it in a public policy exam, prompting students to analyze systemic fragility when faced with an undefinable entity. Administrators felt disoriented. They had never dealt with someone who proposed nothing, opposed nothing, sought no power, yet refused to back down. As attempts to define Elisa increased, she slipped further beyond reach. The system, reliant on control through reaction, struggled to respond to a presence that neither resisted nor submitted. The fear became palpable, seeping into once boisterous meetings. Those who once celebrated Kyle Breener's clean takedowns now distanced themselves. Their silence was the loudest admission. At the police department, no one mentioned Elisa, but everyone felt her presence. Conversations grew shorter, handshakes lost firmness. In internal meetings, those who once defended Kyle now avoided each other's eyes. The department began to leak: funding cuts, suspended programs, withdrawn sponsorships. Former colleagues avoided the records room where the concealed video was accessed. A newly transferred officer asked about the woman in the blurry bulletin board photo but received only a tense silence. A senior officer filed for early retirement. A lieutenant was reassigned a day after dismissing Elisa as just a woman. Officially, there were no disciplinary actions, but internal shifts were unmistakable. Outside the department, the community responded silently. Business owners avoided eye contact when Elisa walked by. Kyle Breener, once celebrated, now found himself a pariah. His keycard stopped working. His email was disabled. People allowed others to go ahead of him in line, subtly exiling him without a word. Rebecca Lynn, the clerk who preserved the video, was indicted for evidence protocol violations. Yet, she wasn't ostracized. Those who worked with her neither defended nor condemned her. A records clerk sent her a note. "I saw it too. But I deleted it. You didn't." The note was leaked online and became a rallying cry for those silently complicit in the system's corruption. Meanwhile, Elisa remained in the community, walking the same routes. Unchanged in routine, she became a symbol without trying. Her silent refusal to act in expected ways dismantling every attempt to define her. When a government memo leaked, revealing her complete disassociation from any agency, the reaction was muted. She was neither protected nor hunted, simply left to exist, a ghostly presence that reminded those in power of their own impotence. Her name became a cautionary tale within training programs. Case M, a reference without context, a warning without clarity. Those who mentioned her felt the weight of her silent defiance, a presence that did not need words to command attention. When she finally left the community center, she left behind a single note: no one should be taught how to face fear simply because the system never learned how not to create it. Her departure was not announced, yet the community kept her routines intact: her chair, her tablecloth, the lavender plant she once watered. The children she taught signed her favorite poem, a silent tribute. And while the world moved on, the echo of her absence lingered in the air like a question no one dared answer. Kyle Breener eventually left the city, a man erased without being touched. Rebecca became a reluctant symbol for those who chose to see and refused to delete. And Elisa became a definition, not of power taken by force, but of the power to make people see themselves without uttering a single word.